On this episode, we cover the Joe Rogan Experience number 2497 with guest Gad Saad. The No Rogan Experience starts now. Welcome back to the show. This is a show where two podcasters with now 219 hours of Rogan experience get to know Joe Rogan. It's a show for anybody who's curious about Joe Rogan, his guests, and what claims they're making, as well as anybody who just wants to understand Joe's ever-growing media influence. I'm Michael Marshall. That right there is Cecil Cicirello. And today, we're going to be covering Joe's June 2026 interview with Gad Saad. So, Cecil, how did Joe introduce Gad in the show notes?
Dr. Gad Saad. It's interesting they're calling him doctor here. I don't know if you ever heard the outcry when Dr. Jill Biden would go by doctor and they would scream about that she's not a real doctor. Anyway, let me just continue. Sorry, I'm jumping in so quick here. Dr. Gad Saad is a scholar at the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom at the University of Mississippi and the host of the Saad or Sad Truth. His book, Suicidal Empathy, Dying to Be Kind, is available now.
Yeah, it is, and we're going to be talking a lot about that. But before we get into that, is there anything else we should know about Gad Saad?
He's a Canadian Lebanese Jew, and he's now trying to immigrate actually to the United States. He mentions it on this very show. He has a PhD in marketing from Cornell and an MBA and an undergraduate degree in math and computer science. He was working at Concordia University up until recently, and he's, one of these anti-social justice Twitter people. He's been doing this for a very long time. That sometimes gets him ratioed pretty badly. And I found this funny article, and if you'll permit me, Marsh, I just wanted to read a tiny bit of it. Okay. It is from an article titled, "Area Cis Man Makes Up a Trans Person to Get Mad About," and it's by James Factora. Last Wednesday, Saad experienced perhaps one of the largest ratios ever seen on Twitter.com when he shared a heartbreaking tale wherein he and his wife patronized a local cafe and encountered a server who was possibly transgender, despite the fact that not once in any possible interaction with a barista would it be contextually appropriate to use a third-person pronoun. Saad's wife was reportedly frozen in fear that she might use the wrong pronoun, and that might offend. So this just tells you a little bit of the outrage stuff that Gad Saad does. He's also on his Twitter feed, and this is how I found him years and years and years ago, because many prominent atheists at the time were retweeting him. He's pretty anti-Islamic, and we are going to find that out in this show today.
Yeah, we are. That is going to be the main segment of this show, in fact. But what else did they talk about here?
Well, I mean, they did sort of branch out, but it was mostly about Islam, then Israel and Gaza and their conflict, how Muslims can be lovely, but are also really dangerous and you shouldn't trust them. And if you let them immigrate, they're eventually going to take over your country.
Lovely stuff. Well, we're going to get into that for the main event. But before we get to the main event, we do want to say a huge thank you to our Area 51 All Access Pass patrons. Those are Fred R. Gruthius, Gina Maloney, Scott Laird, Morgan Gordon, Carissa Gunderson, Lucy Cortez, Angie Mackey, Megan Bray, Matthew Cutler, Autistic Streamer, twitch.tv/MTC_streams, Dr. Andrew Gibson, the online physics tutor, Cindy Lynch, yes, that's Cindy Lynch, Laura Williams, no, not that one, the other one, Darlene, Stone Banana, Billionaire Oligarchs, Left Hand Voodoo, Stargazer 97, Ramtam Tickler, Don't Thank Me, Your Show is Just Worth Investment, 3 seasons, this 4th one is Total Landscaping. Chunky Cat in Chicago loves their Aunt Aoife. I'm tired of arguing over which of us likes Eli the most. We just need to agree that he's our greatest best friend ever.
You can like him the most, Marsh. It's fine.
Hello, Kirsty. Yes, you, Kirsty. I'm talking to you. Hi, can you hear me? And finally...
is it Kirsty?
It's Kirsty.
Was I calling her Christy?
Yeah, I did want to correct that, and I thought that's too pedantic a correction to make.
You should have corrected me. I'm so sorry, Kirsty. I am terrible at reading things aloud. I literally have like a problem in my brain, and I can't read things aloud. So I am so sorry, Kirsty. My brain made that Christy. I am so sorry.
It's fine. I was going to save it for the end of season wrap up in like a couple of months' time, but I'm not going to do that.
Shit now. God, I'm such an idiot.
And finally, final name of our Area 51 All Access Pass patrons. The insanity with the names has got to stop, by which they mean, I suppose, that we're meant to read the names out properly and not just juxtapose them and switch them for a different name that's relatively similar. All of those folks, they all subscribe to patreon.com/No Rogan. You can do that as well. Every one of our patrons, you're going to get access to ad-free episodes. You're going to get early access to them. You're going to get a special Patreon-only bonus segment every single week. And this week, we're going to talk about what a really great guy Colonel Muammar Gaddafi actually was. You can check that out at patreon.com/No Rogan. But now it's time for our main event.
Is it time? I don't know. I guess it's time.
A huge thank you to this week's veteran voice of the podcast. That was Bingo from halfwayok.com. That's OKAY in that. Monday nights on Twitch, they were announcing our main event. Remember that you too can be on this show. You just have to send us a recording of you giving us your best rendition of It's Time. You can send that to NoRoganPod@gmail.com. And remember to tell us how you want us to credit you.
All right,
Cecil will get it wrong.
I will almost certainly. I feel like to atone, I need to walk into the desert after this episode. Marsh is going to be doing this show alone from now on. Oh, gosh. Oh,
it's fine.
The best. I can't wait. All right. So here's the thing. Today's a big show. It's a lot. You may not have ever heard of this person, right? But this is an academic where Joe gets a lot of his information from, and a lot of information, a lot of pretty racist information, to be perfectly frank. So this is an important show, I think, to show sort of how things work in Joe's head. And so we're actually doing 3 full segments today. We're going to start with an anti-Islamic segment. That's going to be our main event. Then we're going to move on to an undercard, and the undercard is going to be about suicidal empathy. And that's a buzzword or a buzz phrase that Joe uses all the time, and he got it directly from this person. And then finally, we will be doing a toolbox on cherry picking, because there is multiple instances of this. We had to trim this down pretty tight. Trim it like a cherry tree, because we had to cherry pick the cherry pick pieces, because there's so many in this episode where he constantly does it. And I know we've done it before, but this is such a great illustration of cherry picking, and cherry picking as a really sort of insidious fallacy here, to sort of be racist. So this whole show is going to be really focusing on his anti-Islamic stance. So we're going to jump right in the very beginning. Now we're going to be coming back to the beginning of the show in the undercard when they talk about suicidal empathy, but they start to get away from it a little bit, and they talk about assimilation in this first clip.
Well, there's no pressure at all to assimilate. You're more than welcome. That's one of the weird things. Yeah. More than welcome to establish a Somali community in Minnesota where no one speaks English.
Exactly.
You know, it's very odd. It's very odd that people want to come here, but when they come here, they want to essentially turn it into a smaller version, at least their neighborhood, of where they came from.
Right. And if it were only that you don't speak English, to me, that's bad enough, and that you're not going to be part of the fabric of the greater society. But fair enough, that's not an existential threat. But if you're then going to be advocating for many of the cultural beliefs that are perfectly antithetical to the whole society, then we have a problem.
Yeah, and a lot of the cultural beliefs that are illogical, they have to be based on something else, and generally that's religion.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked, very often about, Islam and so on.
Okay, so he's talking about the Somali community in Minnesota and how, they've got these cultural beliefs that are antithetical to the whole of society, is what he's saying. Now, it's worth pointing out there are 260,000 people of Somali descent living in the US in 2024, and that's according to the Census Bureau's annual American Community Survey. The largest population is in Minneapolis, St. Paul area. That's home to 84,000 residents, most of whom are American citizens, for one thing, which I'm guessing that means you've got to have a certain competence with the language to get there. But also 58% of the Somalis in Minnesota were even born in the US. And of the foreign-born Somalis in Minnesota, an overwhelming majority, that's 87%, are naturalized US citizens. Okay, so I think that's worth bearing in mind, because he's talking about how there's this huge community who don't speak English. Is it true that none of them speak English? 58% of them born in the US and they don't speak English at all? I think that's just an assumption that Joe is making based on the fact that they're Somali and Muslim, or of Somalian descent and therefore likely to be Muslim, and the fact that he consumes exclusively right-wing media when it comes to these people.
Yeah.
This is, in my opinion, I'm not an American, but this just seems to be like the immigration story of America generally. It's as old as America is. The Italians don't integrate. They refuse to speak the language. They live in their own little areas of the city. Oh, wait a second. Pizza is now American as apple pie, and nobody talks about the Italians not being able to integrate anymore.
Yeah.
There are historic Chinatowns in plenty of American cities. They're there for a reason, but now there's like a massive Asian American community who are distinctly integrated into America.
Yeah.
You could just rinse and repeat that for the next immigrant population to arrive.
Yeah, I mean, they seem to only do this. It's only a discussion around how you can't assimilate if you're brown and a certain religion. Those are ones that you really pay attention to, at least nowadays, right? This is the thing. I come from Chicago, right? I lived in Chicago for many, many years. I just moved out of Chicago right after COVID, or right during COVID, I moved out of Chicago. But I was living in Chicago for a very long time. I live just outside of Chicago now. But the population of Polish immigrants in Chicago is huge. And for a while, there was a talking point that the next most populous city for Poles was Chicago next to Warsaw or something. It was what was a talking point that people were saying to basically show there's a huge Polish immigrant community. I've run into many Polish people who don't speak English or barely speak English, right? But we've been able to communicate. We've been able to do the things we need to do, interact and how we were going to interact, whatever that was. And it was fine. It's perfectly fine. Nobody was hurt in the process, but I don't hear them talking about, someone who is essentially somebody from Europe, somebody who's white, and how they can't integrate into our society. I never hear them saying that. Their English isn't even the official, well, I can't say that now, because I think that they made it the official language. But for many years, all the way up until we got a racist regime in there, English wasn't the national language. We didn't have a national language even. So they keep doing this over and over with different immigrant populations, just like Marsh mentioned, with the ones that were more accepted in the past have become more accepted over time. Okay, so now they're going to talk about Islam. They're going to bring Islam up. This is about an hour later, and they're having a conversation about whether or not the problem is radical Islam.
I have friends that are Muslims.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hundreds of millions of Muslims want to cause zero harm to Jews.
Right. But so the problem is radical Islamism, like we were talking about before.
It's
so you
not
kind of
radical.
Agree.
It's just Islam, and I choose to ignore the parts that I don't like. You're putting an appellation on Islam that is unnecessary.
Okay.
Islam is made up of many tenets. It's not radical Islam. There is no book called Radical Islam. There's only Islam. I mean, Erdogan said there is no moderate Islam. There's just Islam.
Right.
So is he an Islamophobe? Right? So there is a bunch of tenets. There's the one that says kill, 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 take a break, continue killing. Fuck that. I'm going to ignore it because I'm a good person, right? Because there are mean Jews and nice Jews, mean Muslims, nice Muslims.
Right.
So many
westernization of it.
Right.
So what he's arguing here is that there's no such thing as moderate Islam because it's all or nothing. And he contrasts it in a way with his own Judaism in a section like immediately before this. He says that Judaism is much more moderate and things, but Islam just isn't. And he outlines that he can pick and choose the good bits of Judaism and ditch the bad bits of his faith. But like, so he sees that as something he can do with Judaism, but that's impossible to do with Islam. But why would that possibly be the case? Like, I've got friends who are Muslim and they're no more radical Muslims than my Jewish friends are radical Jews. Because religion is made by human beings and human beings always apply their own ethics and morality to it. And so, like, when he's talking about radical Islam here, he says there's no book called Radical Islam. That's true, but there's also no book called Radical Christianity.
Right.
And yet there's a wide variety of views and behaviors exhibited by Christians around the world and even within America. None of it is more true than the rest of it, but clearly some of it is more bigoted and hateful. And so I think he's applying a standard to Islam that he wouldn't apply to any other religion.
Absolutely. And all moderate religions ignore the parts of the book they don't like. That's literally the definition of moderate in comparison to fundamentalists. The fundamentalists, they adhere to as many of the tenets that they possibly can. Ask a United Church of Christ person what they think about Leviticus and how the Bible suggests you're supposed to treat gay people, and then ask an evangelical that question. The UCC person is ignoring the part and they're accepting gay people into their church. They're ignoring that particular passage. So that's possible to do, and the same thing goes for people who practice Islam.
Yeah, and we could have used this for one of the cherry-picking examples as well, because who does he turn to as an arbiter of what counts as proper Islam? He turns to Recep Erdogan, the Turkish leader. Is Recep Erdogan an Islamophobe? Well, no, obviously not. But he is an extremist. So why are you pitching your version of Islam on what an extremist says? I would be just as well as saying, well, there's no such thing as moderate Christianity. And when I cite that, I'd cite my evidence as being that Jerry Falwell or Ian Paisley doesn't believe in moderate Christianity.
Yeah.
What he's doing here, he's giving us a no true Muslim argument is what it is.
He is. He's created the no true Muslim. Yeah. There you go. Okay, next up, because much of the Great Replacement theory and much of modern racism is about sort of assimilation. Now they're talking about assimilating to Western values.
So if there is a way to maintain the Islamic heritage, there's Islamic architecture, there's Islamic poetry, there's Islamic philosophy. There was a period under Islamic rule where many of the ancient texts from, Greek philosophy were safeguarded by Islam, right? So it's not as though that entire civilization is void of incredibly rich things. But there are unfortunately elements of the religion that are not congruent with Western values. If there is a way for us from this side of our mouth to honor Islamic architecture and poetry, and from this side of our mouth, forget the parts that says kill, kill, kill everyone, then I think you could have wonderful flourishing.
Right, for it to evolve then.
Exactly.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Okay, but why wouldn't there be a way for us to do that? Like, would he accept, for example, that it's completely impossible to appreciate the Sistine Chapel without also believing there needs to be another crusade to conquer the unbelievers in the East?
Right.
Or is he giving a pass to Christians that he will never give to Muslims here?
Yeah, and throughout this entire episode, and we'll cover a couple clips where he does this, he's talking about female genital mutilation. He's talking about honor killings, and he brings these up quite a bit in this episode to sort of show that there is these huge negatives that come with cultures that practice Islam. There's these huge negative things, and these are the reasons why we shouldn't be as accepting to this group of people. But nobody's really suggesting what he's saying anyway, that we need to forget about these things. What we're saying is we don't want to paint every single person from that particular culture as if they belong to this sort of this sort of area that was doing all of these bad things, all of these things that we wouldn't allow here. What we're saying is we don't want to paint them all in the same brush. And it's the same thing as if I were to go to Scotland and I were to say, I want to become a citizen. And they would say, well, sorry, we don't accept Americans. They're all in the KKK. We can't accept them. There's nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's the same thing. Well, not all. There are many hate groups in the United States. Many, many hate groups. I don't belong to any of them, but that doesn't. And that means that that many people in the United States, where they travel, they shouldn't be like someone says, "Oh, there's hate groups in the United States. Therefore, everyone who comes from the United States is part of that hate group." It's just not how we treat anybody else. He does, of course, bring up the Crusades in this next clip.
If you crack I don't mean you, but anybody who's listening to this, crack a book to say, okay, let me look at the number of military conquests where Islam was the offensive party, right? Not we were but for example, people say, oh, the Crusades. Well, the Crusades were a retaliation to hundreds of years of Islamic aggression. It didn't come out of nowhere, but there's always what I call the amnesia of causality. People always forget what was the original starting point. Under Islam, as I said, the primary canonical requirement of Islam is to render the entire world Islamic. Now, again, that doesn't mean that every Muslim believes this. That doesn't mean that every Muslim leader believes this, but we're talking about what's in the canons of the religion.
Right.
It is a violently expansionist ideology. I mean, nothing could be clearer.
So, okay, Islam is a violently expansionist ideology, whereas the Crusades were just innocent revenge. That's all it was. It was just retaliation. There was no expansionism about it. This is ludicrous to me. Like, I am not on board with Islam. I think religion fundamentally is a harm for society. Islam is an example of that, as is Christianity.
Agree.
But what he's doing here is making it seem like Islam is uniquely bad. Whereas literally 15 seconds before this, he talked about how it's part of the playbook to always blame some other agent other than our canons for what we're doing. And then in the next breath, he's saying, well, the Crusades were a response to Islamic aggression. So all of a sudden, all of the culpability, responsibility for Christianity, for the Crusades, is not theirs anymore. It's all about Islam. Meanwhile, there's part of this where Joe talks about American military operations in the Middle East and how they give rise to things like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And Gad Saad pushes back and says, well, yeah, if you went back far enough, you could blame anything on that. But they were inherently always going to be like that anyway. So you can't just keep looking for a cause further and further back in history. Now he's changed his mind on that, because now he's talking about how we always look the amnesia of causality. We always forget what was the original starting point. He's going somewhere else in this. He's like making it seem like it's important to go back and look at those kind of first causes. That's the most important thing. Here's a quick question about the Crusades. Would Muslim scholars and Muslim historians view it the way that Gad Saad just explained it? Or would they argue that it's Christians blaming some other agent for why they did what they did in order to absolve themselves of any responsibility? The Crusades, when it came to the Crusades, Christianity saw it as a just war to reconquer Jerusalem, which, yes, had been taken over by Muslim forces 300 years before. So it is still a just war, even if there's been 300 years in between. But it was explicitly an attempt to spread Christianity to the Muslim world. It was a proselytizing war. They were undertaking a holy war as a means of redemption to be forgiven from sin. And we call that jihad when the Muslims do it. So why don't we see it the same way when it's Christians?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Marsh. And he does sort of just hand wave and try to make it seem like here's one motivation, the only motivation for the Crusades. And you're like, the Crusades are very complicated. You can't just be like, this is why they started and just have a one-sentence answer. It's a lot more complicated than that. We could easily talk about all the different ways in which fundamentalist religion is more harsh than other portions of the religion. And I'm in the same boat as you. I think all religion is pretty much not great. I think it's pretty bad. And I think it's pretty bad for society. But I don't look at the shade of a person and make a decision on whether or not their religion is worse or better. I think all religion is pretty terrible. But I think The reason why he's doing this and he's saying this is because he wants to make it seem like, and he says it here and he says it in many other places, Islamic people and anybody who practices that particular religion, they are inherently violent. And we're going to find out later on that actually that's not just sort of something that they're brought up into. He actually makes like genetic arguments later on. So this is someone who I think is very much trying to put this point across over and over and over again and reiterate it that this is a violent people. And if you let them into your country, you're going to face real consequences. Okay, here he talks about Islam's dual logic.
I've explained this previously on the show, but if you allow me, I'll explain it again. Islam has dual logic. Everything in Islam is broken down into two camps. There is Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam and the house of war. Any country that is not yet under Islamic dominion is classified as under the house of war. That's literally the words. Now, any country that has ever become under Islamic dominion, ever, and then Islam loses, canonically, it must revert back to Islam. So Al-Andalusia, right? Andalusia in current Spain was at one point controlled by the Moors, right? Muslims. Therefore, when now you hear a lot of these Islamic extremist guys saying, Inshallah, we will get back Al-Andalusia, it's because once it became ours, it must always belong to us. The same argument applies for Israel. Even though Israel has thousands of years of lineage of the Jews to that land as the indigenous owners of that land, the fact that then Islam took over that region, that means it belongs to Muslims. Now, we may tolerate the Jews to live there, but there can't be a Jewish state there canonically in the religion. Okay?
So he introduces that by saying he's going to explain the dual logic of Islam. And I'm going to explain the dual logic of Gad Saad here. Because what he's saying is, look, it is bad that Islam sees any country that used to be Muslim but was then lost as canonically Islam and therefore, as canonically Islamic and therefore must be reverted back to Islam. That's a bad thing, he says. Meanwhile, yes, Israel was created in 1948 and the Muslim occupants of Palestine were moved in order that Jewish people could be moved in. But that's completely okay because that land used to be Jewish. It used to be under Jewish denomination, Jewish dominion, which Judaism lost. So he's saying canonically, it is right that it reverts back to Judaism. That is a good thing. There's his dual logic here.
That's amazing. It's literally the same thing.
In the same clip.
It's the same. It's amazing that he says this in the same clip. We didn't cut any tape.
Nope.
And it's him saying the exact same thing about both. It's like that Spider-Man meme where everybody's pointing at each other. It's the same thing. What a great piece of tape just to hear him try to tie himself in knots to talk about that. All right, so next up, he talks about a percentage increase in Islamic adherence.
So those are just facts. You could study the history of Islam to count. Okay, there are currently 57, well, if you include the Palestinian territories, in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, there are 56 or 57 countries that are part of that bloc that are Islamic. Each of those countries once upon a time started with 0% Islam, right? I mean, it wasn't magical. So Indonesia was not Islamic once, right? Libya was not, right? Many of those countries were Christians, by the way, right? Egypt was Coptic Christian. Syria was tons of Christians. Lebanon, within my lifetime, I was born in a Christian majority country. Today, within my lifetime and yours, it has completely flipped to Muslim majority. So wherever Islam goes, sometimes it might take 5 years to flip it. Sometimes it might take 500 years. But as the Taliban explained to us, the American soldiers have the watches. We have all the time in the world. So it's a long project. So when Islam comes into the United States, it's not as though suddenly the United States of America is going to become under Sharia law tomorrow morning. But if you have the imagination to extrapolate in 200-300 years, if you were to repeat Dearborn and Paterson, New Jersey, and Minneapolis into 20 more cities, 50 more cities, 100 more cities, would you be living in the same United States?
Right.
And if not, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
So he lists all those different countries to show how they've become more Islamic over time. They used to have 0% Muslim populations, now it's much higher. Well, yeah, all those countries also were 0% Christian at some point in history as well. But apparently that doesn't count. That's not an issue because Christianity is different to Islam for reasons. And he will come into his reasons, and they aren't reasons that I would agree with. And then notice again, he's giving us another citation for who gets to speak for what counts as the plan for Islam. We've already had Erdogan of Turkey. Now it's the Taliban giving us evidence of how Muslims think. I would argue the Taliban are examples of how the Taliban think, how Muslim extremist terrorists would think, but that is not how the average person who happens to be Muslim thinks. So he's kind of tarring them all with the worst possible brush here. And he says, it's not that the US is going to be under Sharia law tomorrow morning. It's going to take a longer timeline than that. Obviously, that isn't how immigration works. Right. It's just not how immigration works at all. It hasn't worked that way with any group of immigrants in US history that I'm aware of, other than, I guess, the Christians. I guess the Christians came over, and it did work that way. The Native Americans weren't immediately under Christian rule, but pretty soon the entire country was. So maybe Christianity is the only exception to that.
We were 0% Christian at one point, and then we became very Christian afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. But what typically happens is the first generation of immigrants come over, and many people stay within their culture, within their communities, within their languages, the things that they already know, because moving somewhere is scary, and because communities and languages being in those kind of spaces, they're familiar, and it's much easier to stay amongst the familiar. And then the second generation, they spread a little further because they've got more of a kind of an establishment in that country. They pick up more of the culture. And by the third generation, they're more part of America than wherever their grandfathers used to live. And by the fourth generation, they're actively complaining about these new immigrants who are coming over from a new country refusing to assimilate.
Yeah, it just seems like such a crazy perspective. He says, if your country was suddenly filled with Islamic people, wouldn't it be more Islamic? Yeah, sure, but that's not how it works, and it won't be like that, because just like Marsh explains, they're going to become Americans, and they're going to adopt some of these cultural norms that are here in the United States. We've seen that happen time and time and time again. And also, I just want to say this because it seems like everybody seems like they need to come over here. Whoever comes here who's an immigrant, they need to just be American. You got to be American. But being American means retaining part of your culture. That's literally a feature of the United States, not a bug. We already have laws to prevent any of the negative things that he keeps bringing up in this podcast, like honor killings and female genital mutilation. So we already have laws against that stuff. So that's not something people bring here. And if they do, then they're prosecuted. But what we get instead is people wear different stuff than you do. They pray at different times. They sometimes speak a second language that you don't, and then they make delicious foods. That's the sort of stuff you get. It seems like they seem to think when they come here, they have to sort of be okay, here you are in the United States. Here's your plate of fried chicken and biscuits and gravy. You can't eat any of your food anymore, and you have to speak with a Southern American accent. It's like people come from all over the world, and they come here and they bring their cultures, and we kind of assimilate to them just as much as they assimilate to us.
Yeah, exactly. The thing is, you've got to come here and be American, but we won't help you do that in any kind of way, and we won't give you any time for that to happen.
Right. We don't put a landing pad or runway down for you at all. It's immediate. You better be American the moment you step in this country. All right. Next up, he talks about when he moved to Montreal.
So in other words, look, my family, we moved to Montreal from Lebanon. We moved to Montreal for three reasons. Number one, Montreal is also French. In Lebanon, Lebanon used to be a French protectorate, so you already spoke French in Lebanon, in addition to Arabic. So that was one. Number two, the immigration policy for war refugees was maybe easier to navigate Canada was a more welcoming country than, say, maybe United States. But number 3 is that my mother's sister had already emigrated to Montreal with her husband. And that husband became the director general of the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal, which is the biggest hospital in Montreal. It's the Jewish General, right?
So he's talking about how easy it was for his family to move somewhere because they spoke a common language with the place, and that there were policies in place that actively made it more welcoming to them. And as a result, his family were then able to culturally assimilate quite easily. Meanwhile, he's arguing there should be policies that make it harder for other immigrants to do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
And when they fail to assimilate to the degree that his family were able to do, it's because those other immigrants are Muslims who are just culturally and ethnically incapable of assimilation in that kind of way. Like, his assimilation was because he was welcomed, because the policies welcomed him. He even said that he had family who'd already moved there. Now, when it comes to immigrants moving to somewhere because their family were already there, that is a right-wing talking point of we need to stop these people being not quite anchor babies, but that kind of family family visas, family migration plans. That is an actively evil thing if you listen to people who would agree with Gad Saad about Muslims. But he's talking about how beneficial it was for him and his family. And it just shows, again, this kind of dual logic he's got going on.
This next clip is talking about universities and how they're pro-Palestinian.
Could you explain how this is done? Like, what do you think is happening in the universities where they're tilting people towards a pro-Palestinian perspective?
Well, I mean, several ways. One, I mean, if it's directly through funding, you fund the $30 million whatever, you're probably not going to have faculty members who are going to be incredibly vociferous in their, anti-Islamic rhetoric. If you have that, I'll give you an example. When I was potentially going to come, maybe they don't want me to hear this, but so be it. When I was, one of the places that I was being recruited at was potentially University of Austin, right? And they were going to make me an offer. The University of Austin doesn't have a tenure system. They have a constitution. It's a different kind of system. Of course, what allowed me to not be canceled, I would have been canceled 30 years ago for all the things that I say and all the things that I write, is that I was protected by tenure. And so I was very concerned about whether the fact that they don't have tenure, what happens if tomorrow...
Right.
Okay. And I remember having a conversation, I won't mention his name, but you can probably guess who it could be, where I said, what happens under your constitution if tomorrow you get a $30 million donation from Mohammed Beltalal and he says, that little Jewish professor who's going on Joe Rogan and talking about bad things about Islam, that has to stop. His answer was, the gentleman my interlocutor was, well, we're on the same team. I fully support what you're saying. Well, you support what I'm saying until money talks, right? I can pick you a number, a donation number, where you'll no longer support with equal alacrity my criticism of Islam. Maybe it's 100 million. Maybe it's 200 million. But
just given the people that I know that are the founders of the University of Austin, I don't know if that's likely.
You mean there is no reservation price?
It doesn't seem like they would be willing to go against the idea of Israel.
Okay, so he's not saying there isn't a reservation price. He's saying there's just they wouldn't go against Israel specifically, which I think is an important kind of distinction there.
Yeah.
Hey, maybe there shouldn't be faculty members of public universities who are, quote, incredibly vociferous in their anti-Islamic rhetoric. Like, criticize religion, generally, absolutely fine. Criticize specific religions, fine. Criticize the ideas all you want. But what we're seeing in this conversation is that, Gad Saad fundamentally believes that Muslims as a bloc and as a culture are incapable of living in the modern world without resorting to violent expansionism, his words, and attempting to conquer every square inch of the planet in the name of Islam. Like, leave aside the influence of money. I don't know that I would trust him to treat a Muslim, like an individual Muslim student, fairly, given the things that he said here. I don't think that's someone who should be in a position of public authority.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear Joe have a guest on that talks about the tenure system as a protection. And I've heard him talk about the tenure system when it's someone saying things Joe doesn't like, as if it is awful and it is protecting the wrong people. It's basically, it's a terrible thing. But he will in some ways make it seem like if you like have, and I'm going to use his language, woke talking points, the tenure system protects you, and then you can spread this sort of dangerous ideology. But I would argue that Dr. Saad's stuff that he's spreading is dangerous ideology, and he's protected as well by the tenure system. And that system has protected him for a very long time. And listen to how he's interviewing for new jobs. So he can also continue to say the same things he was saying because he wants to have that academic freedom. And if we want academic freedom, you've got to have good and bad academic stuff that's coming out that you're going to agree with and you're going to think is sometimes pretty harmful. But it seems that Joe only cares about it when it's stuff that he doesn't like or he doesn't think is good that's spread into the world.
Yeah, he wants academic freedom for the things he agrees with, which is not freedom. That's complicity. Meanwhile, the University of Austin, it's an unaccredited organization. It's got 34 staff members. It's got 150 students. They actually lost a lot of prominent staff members recently, funny enough on this note, after the president of the University of Austin supported Donald Trump's demands that universities align ideologically with his administration or face punishment. And he actually was going after Harvard in particular. So, yeah, a lot of people left University of Austin because they were refusing to stand up for academic freedom. And that's probably why they were recruiting for a new teacher within the anti-woke space in the first place.
Yeah, we don't like cancel culture, so we found a way to cancel the people we don't like.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Amazing that's how they did this. All right, now they're going to be talking about Quebec and Islamic immigration there.
In Quebec, for example, as I may have mentioned previously on this show, Quebec had a very open policy towards Islamic immigration. And the reason that in Quebec it was so is because the most important sense of personhood in Quebec is that you maintain your linguistic identity. We are French. We don't want to be subsumed by the mean English language. Yes? Mm-hmm. So therefore, since many of the immigrants coming from Islamic countries were also Francophone, in their infinite wisdom, the Quebec government said, hey, here's a great idea. There was a 1997 civil war between the Algerian government and hardcore extremist Muslims. The latter lost, so they were fleeing from getting killed by the Algerian government. Why don't you open the borders for them to Quebec? The decapitations will happen only when they say bonjour to you. So given that they will address you in French before they behead you, don't worry about it. Let them all in. I'm obviously being facetious, but the point is that hundreds of thousands of Islamic immigrants came to Quebec. I started seeing the changes, a lot more women in hijab, a lot more dangerous to go to campus, a lot more requirements for accommodations, prayer rooms, public prayers.
Jesus Christ, this is extreme to me, in especially because he himself is an immigrant into Montreal. Yeah. So if he was faced with somebody who was born and raised in Canada complaining that he'd been allowed into Montreal, would he think that was entirely reasonable if there was any concessions made to his culture? Yeah. Oh, suddenly I'm seeing more synagogues and how disgusting that is. Yeah. Like if he heard that, he would consider that deeply anti-Semitic. And yet here he is saying the same thing about Islam, not recognizing, because of his dual logic, that these are just the same arguments repurposed against people he hates this time.
Yeah, great point. And he brings this up. He says, there's going to be beheadings. And he's like, oh, of course I'm being facetious. He's like, but it really did change. And it changed because they wore different clothes and they prayed at a different time in a different way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Spoke a different language.
So what? I'm sure that was very tragic and shocking to you, but did anything else happen? They had to have prayer room accommodations or different accommodations. The thing is that he makes it seem like it was this awful integration of people that came in and they've changed the whole culture. And that's just not the case. And then he says it's more dangerous. Now, to Joe's credit, Joe asks him, what do you mean by more dangerous? And then he has to say on this next clip that we're not going to play, in the next bit of tape there, he says, well, for a semester, I had to have security because people were giving me death threats. But look, this is a guy who's been and this is in 2017 that this is happening, right? So in 2017 is when he goes to get this security. For decades on Twitter, he has been an anti-Islamic provocateur. So eventually someone is going to, probably make some sort of threat against him. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's terrible that it happened. But at a certain point, if you keep spreading hate speech over and over and over again, there's going to be somebody who's going to do something and maybe say something pretty rash to you. And he's making it seem like he's the victim here. He is an anti-Islamic provocateur. So sometimes when that happens to those people, that happens because of things that they did and they got the ball rolling for.
Yeah, exactly. Like the thing is, he might be getting these kind of threats in that semester in 2017. Is that indicative of how the average Canadian was feeling threatened by an influx of Muslims? I'm against the idea of sending people threats, unequivocally against that. But his experience isn't the par for the course, and he's making it seem like it's just normal. Also, he's talking about how he says about how he needed security for a semester. But he's talking about how immigration is fundamentally changing the entire cultural landscape of his country, which meant that there was a couple of months where he needed security and then not subsequently in the next 9 years. So how fundamental were these changes to Quebec and Montreal and Canadian culture? I'd argue not. Things probably just simmered back down to how they were before.
And did the regular person have to hire security, right?
Yeah.
Did the regular person in Montreal and in Quebec, I'm sorry, I mispronounce it all the time. I apologize, Quebecies. But did they have to hire security? And the answer is, of course they didn't. But like, he's making it seem like, and we're not playing this clip because it's a long piece where he's sort of explaining his trials and tribulations living up there. But it basically is him just saying, look, I had to hire security, and this is why you should be afraid of this entire group of people.
Yeah.
Last clip in our main event. This is really just a interesting piece of tape. It basically is, if you know the number of Muslims in a society, you're going to be able to make a very certain prediction about it.
The reason why and I'm going to get threats for this. The reason why I appreciate Trump is precisely because he implements things that most politicians wouldn't have the testicular fortitude to do. But that's what you want in a great leader, right? Most people come in, do their time, parasitize the system, and then leave having accomplished nothing.
Right.
The reason why Donald Trump has had not one, not two, but 3 assassination attempts, that is a testament to the fact that he is a danger to the status quo. Why? Because he does things, whether you agree with him or not. He's bold. He's fearless. He doesn't give a shit. To your point, most politicians would rather go, la, 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 I don't want to hear it, until it's too late. The playbook is very clear. Depending on the number of Muslims in a society, you can exactly predict the level of conflict. And that statement that I just said holds true, notwithstanding the fact that most Muslims are perfectly lovely. Both those statements are both veridical. So when you are 0 to 2%, you're just a quiet, exotic minority. When you're 3 to 5%, you become a lot more engaged politically. When you become 6 to 10%, you start creating Sharia no-go zones. We don't want your dogs here. This is not tolerated in our zone. Look at Britain. Look at France. So in the same way that I can predict the trajectory of diabetes, and no, I'm not saying that Muslims are, I'm drawing an analogy. Okay.
Yeah.
I am explaining a trajectory. So if you wish to protect the liberties that make the United States so uniquely wonderful in the full range of societies that have ever existed, recognize that all religions are not equally likely to be congruent with the American experience. If you do, you'll survive. If you won't, your future descendants will rue the day you were born.
Get rid of certain religions, man.
Yeah, and that is 30 seconds before the end of the show as well. That is his parting thought. It's that goodbye. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And I just want to, before we jump into his sort of the screed he has here, or the anti-Islamic piece of this, I just want to say, like, his the way he's thinking about why there were attempts on Donald Trump's life is I can't even make sense of it. He's basically saying he's really one of these people who does things, and therefore the status quo hired a killer to come after him. Is he saying deep state stuff? I don't know what he's talking about, as if it's somehow the people that tried to kill Donald Trump are connected in some way. And if you look at like some of the motivations we were able to glean, they're not in any way connected, except for they're just mentally unstable people.
Yeah, like the only way what he said could make sense is if he believes that the assassinations were actually orchestrated by the 1970s glam rock band Status Quo. That's the only thing that would make sense. He's upset Status Quo, and so Rick Parfitt in particular has come at him. In Francis, he has come at him to try and take him down. It's the only thing that can make sense. Also, do you notice he's talking about how, Donald Trump is the only one with the testicular fortitude to be bold enough and brave enough to institute policies that scapegoat a minority community for political power.
Right?
Because what Donald Trump has done towards the policies that is enacted towards the Muslim communities are the easiest things for someone to do in order to scapegoat somebody. This isn't brave leadership. This is like just the most craven populism, craven scapegoating populism. That's all he's really doing. But Gad Saad's happy with that. He's delighted with that. And that's because what he does, even in this clip, when he's talking about if you know the number of Muslims in a population, you can directly predict the amount of conflict. He's directly blaming Muslims as a community, as a bloc, for violence and conflict. Their presence is what causes the violence and the conflict. But, individually, they're lovely, he says. Individually, they're fine.
Yeah.
For a bloodthirsty would-be global conqueror, they're absolutely lovely individually, but it's when you get them together.
Yeah, they're like gremlins. Don't get them wet. Whatever you do, don't feed them after midnight.
Yeah, and the thing is, in that, look at where what he uses as evidence. He talks about the Sharia no-go zones and where you can't allow your dogs in places. And he says, look at Britain. I am in Britain. There are people who might be listening to this who don't recognize that this accent isn't a coincidence. I am genuinely British. I actually know what's happening in this country. There aren't Sharia no-go areas. He's just believing right-wing propaganda that he's seen on Twitter. That's all this is.
Yeah.
And if you don't recognize that Muslims, what he's saying is, what he ends with here, if you don't recognize that Muslims aren't congruent with the American experience, your future descendants will rue the day you were born. Yeah. That is an incredibly strong and inflammatory line to end on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is the last minute of a podcast where a guy is trying to tell you and sell you on the thesis of his book. Let people into your own country and you're going to get pushed out. This is totally zero-sum thinking, and it's great replacement theory trash, but it is perfectly peddled the entire episode through this book that he's trying to sell and through all of these sort of political policies that literally go against Islamic populations, all in multiple countries, in your country and in my country, right? And certainly in other places, in Canada, obviously, multiple countries have this sort of right-wing policy against this very large group of people. And what's crazy to me is he has this equation when it comes to Islamic people. He's saying, look, these people, if there's a group of these people, they're going to be dangerous because we know by their concentration, they're just going to be dangerous. How do you explain the dangerous crime that happens in large, mostly white cities like Billings or Springfield, Missouri, or Anchorage, where there's still crime happening? It's not like those crime not happening. It's not like there's murders not happening, but those are mostly white populations. How do you explain those? And the thing is what causes crime most often is poverty. That's what causes crime. And it just so happens that we're also racist against people and they have less opportunities. So often the people who are in the most poverty in our country happen to also be from minority groups. That's who is affected mostly by poverty. And so they seem to think and we're going to find this out in a few moments, it's a genetic problem when it really is an economic issue. Okay, we're going to move on to our undercard now.
And the undercard's banging. The undercard's filled with fights.
So for the undercard this time, we're going to be talking about suicidal empathy. Now, this is a common phrase that Joe uses on his show, and Gad Saad is the person who sort of has coined this phrase.
Yeah, because we've heard Joe talk about suicidal empathy so many times. That's the reason we're doing Gad Saad in the first place, is because so many different interviews, so many different shows we've covered, Joe says to someone, have you heard of the term suicidal empathy? Gad Saad told me all about it. And so that is, this, we couldn't not cover it. And you can really see Gad's entire thesis as played out in this show. That, I assume, is what the book is going to be all about as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is very this is at the very beginning of the show. The show just opens up and they're talking about suicidal empathy within the first couple minutes.
So we are a thinking and a feeling animal, right? Both our cognitive system is important and our affective system is important. For example, advertisers recognize that if I'm trying to sell you a mutual fund, I need to engage your cognitive system. Here are the 7 reasons why you should buy my mutual fund. If I'm trying to sell you perfume, I don't tell you this is what Harvard physiologists think about the science of olfaction, right? I need to engage your affective system. So in that case, I will show you a pretty girl on a horse with beautiful hair, and the brand name will be Mystère, right? I'm just engaging your emotional system. Well, the parasitic mind was the story of what I need to do to hijack your cognitive system, your ability to think rationally. And hence, there were all these parasitic ideas that destroyed your capacity to think. Mm-hmm. But for me to completely zombify you and hijack you, I also need to zombify your affective system. That's where suicidal empathy comes in. So if I can hijack both your cognitive and emotional systems, you become a wood cricket, which we could talk about what that reference is if you want.
What's a wood cricket?
So the wood cricket is an insect that abhors water. It wants nothing to do with water. But when it is parasitized by a neuroparasite called the hairworm.
Oh, I've seen this.
Right? The hairworm needs the wood cricket to happily and merrily commit suicide by jumping into the water, because that's the only way that the hairworm can complete its reproductive cycle. So once the hairworm hijacks the wood cricket's ability to think and to invoke its survival instinct, it erases its survival instinct, then it is owned by the hairworm. And so I use that principle to explain suicidal empathy.
Okay, it's important for us to play this clip because we're going to put a pin in this, and he's going to compare a group of people to parasites that are manipulating other people to hurt themselves so that other group can gain. So that's what he's going to do throughout most of this episode. And that is just the Great Replacement theory, right? That's all it is. In the Great Replacement theory, that group happens to be elites that are manipulating the system so that peoples of color can take life, liberty, and happiness from white people. We'll see where he lands with this, but that's how the Great Replacement theory goes.
Yeah, and there's a reason he can't do the traditional version of the Great Replacement theory, because in that theory, those elites are Jewish, and he is not going to be the one to say that it's elite Jews who are manipulating people in this kind of way. So I imagine that's why there's a modification of the Great Replacement theory in his mind, just as there was we've seen previously with Barry Weiss when she talked about the Great Replacement theory and changed what the conspiracy theorists have to say about Jewish people in it. I will just point out his advertising point here is completely facile. Like, okay, please tell me, Mr. Professor of Marketing, how could you possibly advertise a cosmetic smell by appealing to a cognitive system? How would you possibly do that? And equally, you'd be an idiot to think that somebody's going to take out a 6-figure debt as a mortgage based on feeling alone. So it's about like cutting your cloth accordingly. And I do think, and normally I'd save this for the off the record segment, I do think these two men are in no position to criticize people for having had their capacity to think destroyed. These are not the people to make that argument.
Yeah, yeah. Some would argue that that Joe's brainworm is Twitter. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, the thing that's thrown Joe into the water is Twitter.
Twitter and Gad Saad.
I know, right? He's crawling out of his ear after he's in the water. Okay, so this is really something, this next clip. This is talking about blank slates.
So I call them, in the book, I call them blank slate felons, because if you remember the term blank slate, So in the parasitic mind, I talk about social constructivism. Everything is a social construction. It's the tabula rasa premise. We're born with empty minds, with no individual differences in our potentiality, and it's only our unique life trajectories and our unique patterns of socialization that end up making us who we become, which in a small sense, that's true. My life experience and yours is an indelible part of who we are as individuals. But there are individual differences that people are born with different proclivities eventually of committing crimes or of being NBA players or of being the next Einstein. It's a very hopeful message, though, to start with the blank slate premise.
Yeah, it's just not accurate.
Exactly. Because if you and I are both parents, I would love to subscribe to the idea that if only I knew the exact schedule of reinforcement of how to ensure that my child becomes the next Lionel Messi or the next Albert Einstein, he too can become that.
Right.
That's a lot more hopeful than thinking, you know what, I don't think my son has the morphological features that are ever going to make him to be the next NBA star. He's too short. He doesn't have the right athletic tools.
People are born with different proclivities eventually of committing crimes or of being NBA players. Those are your two options, I guess. You only get two options. I wonder who he's talking about here, Marsh. Is maybe he's suggesting that people who are born Muslim can't be as ethical as other people, regardless of their upbringing. And this is 10 minutes into the show. I wrote that note and I said, let's see where he goes with it. We know where he goes with it. We know what he talks about for the rest of the show because we already played that tape for you.
Yeah, exactly. And notice that he's going from talking about felons, actual criminals, as blank state, empty minds, to talk about whether you have the physical gift to be Leo Messi or an NBA star. So he's conflating the genetic with the moral. Like your likelihood to be a criminal is somehow a consequence of your innate qualities and attributes at birth. And that is the language often employed by eugenicists.
Yeah,
and I would argue if I was Gad Saad, I'd be trying to avoid saying things that sound an awful lot like eugenics because people might think that I'm a eugenicist at that point, and I wouldn't want people to think that. He also says, he thinks he's solved essentially the nature versus nurture argument because he says that nurture has influence in only a small sense. That's what he's talking about, that nurture only has a small sense of influence. So what he's instead arguing for is genetic essentialism. And once you're at a genetic essentialist point of view, it's not just about your proclivities towards crime, but also some genes are better than others.
It sounds a lot like sort of scientific racism and eugenicists thinking that happened at the turn of the 1900s, right? 1900 when 18 to 1900s, the turn of that century, there's essentially a lot of this sort of thought that's flying through. People are trying to, they're writing books on eugenicist thought. They're writing books on scientific racism. And in fact, there's a quote from Madison Grant from The Passing of the Great Race, which is a eugenics book, a very important eugenics book. And he mentions a thing called suicidal ethics in that quote. And it feels really similar to this kind of thinking. And at first, when I heard suicidal ethics and then also heard suicidal empathy, I was like, wow, those sound really similar. They sound very similar. It also sounds like he's pulling other stuff. I'm not saying that he's like a guy who believes Madison Grant or has read Madison Grant or is that sort of influenced his thought. But I will say that this sort of zero-sum thinking has sort of a path of least resistance. And regardless of where you start here, he may have never heard of it, but I think the conclusions always come back. So if you are following these sort of racist ideals, your racist ideals are going to distill down into this sort of idea of suicidal something, right? Suicidal ethics or empathy.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, I'm not going to say, I'm not proposing that he is a eugenicist. I'm not saying that remotely, but I will say if you want people to not confuse you for a eugenicist, you shouldn't say as many things that are exactly like to what a eugenicist is saying. But if he does actually happen to believe some eugenics kind of ideas, well, that's not his fault because nurture's only a small sense of it. So he was just clearly innately born with the attributes to be a eugenicist, perhaps.
Okay, next up. He talks about suicidally empathetic victims.
And so it's easy to understand why people can be parasitized by these ideas. This person of color was born into a white supremacist society. So he's already been victimized by society. And for you to now punish him by having him, in the penal system, you're doubly punishing him. So shouldn't you give him a second chance? And by second chance, we mean 186 chance. That's part of suicidal empathy. But suicidal empathy doesn't even apply to only that. The victims of rape are themselves suicidally empathetic towards their rapists. Can I share some of those incredible stories?
Sure.
So I start off in the book with an example from a Norwegian man who had been sodomized by a Somali migrant. Because the Norwegians are very kind and empathetic, they don't believe in long sentences, he served maybe, 3 years or 4, like a pretty short sentence for a rape of another man. When he was being released, he was going to be deported. The victim of that rape had this huge existential angst and guilt because now that, Ahmad was going to be released back to Mogadishu, he wouldn't end up being able to maximally flourish like he should be. Well, our emotional system did not evolve to be empathetic toward our rapists. That would be an example of someone who's being suicidally empathetic. Another great example.
What happened in that case?
What in terms of whether he was deported or not?
Yeah.
I think, I don't want to misspeak, but I think he was deported to the screams and lamentations of his victim. There is a woman who was raped in Germany, and when the authorities were trying to find out more about who the perpetrators were, she lied to them and said that they were speaking in German, even though they were speaking in Arabic and Farsi, because if she had truly said what their language was, then those communities would have been marginalized. So, there's just an endless number of, like a litany of these examples. And therefore, suicidal empathy is really pervasive once I could recognize the mechanism.
Yeah, it's really pervasive once you start picking at those cherries here as he's doing. This is why this also could have gone in the cherry picking section. But it's got to go in this section because I did some digging on this. And would you be surprised to hear that these stories aren't quite as he is portraying them to be?
That's interesting. That never happens on Joe's show.
Never happens. Even though he says he doesn't want to misspeak, but he does talk about how they were deported to the screams and lamentations of his victim. He says immediately after saying he's not going to misspeak. So that apparently is him not misspeaking here. None of this is as straightforward as he makes out. Let's take the first case. In August 2016, a 26-year-old Norwegian man, Karsten Nordal Håken, was part of a TV show that documented young people's struggle with mental health for various different reasons and the therapy they were going through. And he was on that show because, as he said, quote, "What makes me unusual is that I'm a man and that I have been raped. That's what I'll talk about," unquote. So in 2009, he was raped by a Somali asylum seeker that he'd given shelter to. That person went to prison. I will point out, Gad Saad says, because the Norwegians are very kind and empathetic, they don't believe in long sentences. Again, that isn't the reason they don't believe in long sentences. What they're doing is evidence-based rehabilitation policy.
A little different.
It's not out of an overabundance of kindness or empathy. He's misrepresenting this. In the show, Karsten talks about how he started to abuse drugs after his rape ordeal, how he dropped out of school, and how he receded from social interaction and therefore struggled an awful lot with mental health. And how he talks about the work that he's done to process his traumatic experience, how he's been able to move through all of that and put his life back together and to admit it to people and not feel shame about admitting it because there's so much shame tied up in being a victim. And that's what he's really talking about here. And he was on the show in order to finish on the point that if you're a victim, you have to share your story with someone. It doesn't matter who. You've got to start sharing it in order to start dealing with that trauma, dealing with that shame, and processing it to be able to live your life again. That's what his story was about. But as part of the promo for the show, he wrote an article for a website called NRK, where he talked about the shame and the guilt that he felt. And in it, he explained, "I'm a heterosexual man who was raped by a Somali asylum seeker. My life fell apart, but now I feel guilty about him being sent out of the country." He explains he feels lucky that his ordeal wasn't as bad as it could have been for other rape victims. He says he's lucky that his life in Norway is much more privileged than the attacker's life in Somalia. And he explains, "I'm the reason that he couldn't be in Norway anymore, but instead had to be sent to an uncertain future in Somalia. He's already served his sentence in prison. Should he now be punished again and this time much harder?" So what this all was a nuanced exploration of guilt and trauma and compassion in the spirit of the openness of the TV show. He wasn't arguing against the person being sent, but he was talking about how he was feeling as a result.
Yeah.
This article went viral on Facebook. It was then picked up by Breitbart, Russia Today, The Sun, The Independent, The Mirror Online, The Daily Mail, and The Daily Caller. Many of those, it's worth pointing out, they actually falsely reported that he'd actually been anally raped by the attacker, which wasn't true. That is not what his attack consisted of, which I think is important because it kind of shows, like, he made clear that what actually had happened. It shows that the motivations of those article wasn't factual reporting or concern for the victims at all.
Yeah.
It was about a sensationalized story and they didn't bother checking the details. This is a quote from an article about it. Writing for the coffee house blog, The Spectator, the conservative and Islam critic, author, and commentator Douglas Murray
I remember him.
Goes as far as to showcase as Carsten's guilt as representative of a new psychosocial phenomenon. He says perhaps the Hawken case could be used to coin the term Norway syndrome, from an affliction that causes rape victims to feel concern over the prospects of their rapists. There certainly should be a term because I suspect we're going to need one in our vibrant and exciting future. For not only did the international news and opinion websites mentioned, they didn't just brush over the Norwegian TV series, they also cherry-picked his story to pick out his self-proclaimed guilt, and then ran with the guilt as the main thing. So that's this story here. He wasn't writing at all about, first and foremost, how guilty he felt about a rapist being deported. He was talking about his entire story. And these various places like Breitbart and The Spectator focused on the guilt element and took that bit out and made it the center of the story when it hadn't been previously. And now it's the reason Gad Saad is bringing up all this on Joe Rogan. Let's move to the second case. This is a case of Celine Gioran, who was the spokesperson for the left-wing youth movement Solid in Germany. She was attacked by 3 men in the city of Mannheim, where she works as a refugee activist. After the assault, she went to the police, but she didn't tell them the ethnicities of the men or the fact that they were speaking Arabic or Farsi, initially because, quote, she didn't want to stoke more hatred against migrants in Germany. So that is the story as Gad Saad is putting it forward here, and it is true to that extent. But the thing is, if you read up, as I did in Der Spiegel magazine, why she initially lied to the police, she said it's because the police officer that she went to see, like she reported that she'd been attacked, the police officer met her and said, are you the person who had their bag stolen? Because that's how she reported the attack initially. She said yes. His very next question was, were they refugees? She hadn't even had a chance by this point to tell them that she'd been raped before he was asking about their refugee status on an assumption. And in that moment, she felt angry that the cop was making racist assumptions. So she initially told them that the attacker was a mixed group of people. What Saad isn't mentioning when he tells this story is that 12 hours after that initial police interview, she went back to the police and told them the ethnicities and the more details of the attackers. So what we've got here is a rape victim who initially responded badly in the hours after she was raped while still deep in the trauma of it, who then corrected things less than a day later. This isn't an example of suicidal empathy. It's an example of trauma clouding judgment and a lack of any kind of empathy and professionalism from the police. That's what this is a story of. And here's a minor point, but I think it's worth making here. Celine Gioran isn't a German name typically. It's a Turkish name. Germany has a lot of Turkish immigration. Celine's grandparents, in fact, are Turkish. That she's from an immigrant family, or at least kind of second generation or third generation. She's German, but the way that Gad tells the story is so specific. I think the perception of the story shifts if you know that the victim herself is of Muslim heritage here. I think it completely changed the perplexion of this story. And it makes sense that she is, because she could say to the police they were speaking Arabic or Farsi, which I don't think the average person is going to be able to just pluck out and say. So I think these two stories are not at all examples of what he's raised them before. Suicidal empathy, he said it's pervasive when you look for it. But yeah, it is. If you're able to cherry pick the examples, present them completely absent of any vital context, and then strip away the agency of the victims in order to serve your agenda and your book. What we can say, Gad Saad is absolutely not behaving with an abundance of empathy when he tells these stories. Suicidal or otherwise, there's no fucking empathy here.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out that not only is cherry picking going on when you're selecting these cases, but you're also cherry picking only violence that is perpetrated by these very specific groups. This type of violence happens all the time with other groups, right? These groups, these papers, and Gad Saad and Joe, they're only talking about it because it's this particular group that's perpetrating it. But it happens all the time, and it happens by people who are born in these countries all the time at a way higher rate. But they never talk about it in those instances. They only talk about it when it's somebody else from another country or somebody who is an asylum seeker, so that they can cherry pick that particular instance.
Yeah, absolutely that.
Next, he brings up cultural relativism.
When you look at the root of that, how is it so common? Like what happened?
So I think that's a great question. I think, again, it goes back to the 1-2 punch of parasitic mind and suicidal empathy. In order for the fertile grounds to be available for suicidal empathy to barge in, I first have to have certain ideas that are implanted in your brain. So that sounds very abstract. So let me give you a concrete example. Cultural relativism is a parasitic idea that I discuss in the parasitic mind. It basically says, who are you to judge the beliefs and the practices of another culture? Shut up, racist, right? So there are honor killings, shut up. There are child brides, shut up. There are female genital mutilations, shut up. Don't judge other cultures. Well, if you internalize that parasitic idea that it is not appropriate to ever judge the cultural practices of another culture, then that renders you impotent when you're making judgments about who should be let into your country, about whether you want an increase of people who hold those views or not. Therefore, that leads to the suicidally empathetic position that all immigrants are equally likely to assimilate within the American ethos or the Western ethos. So we started off with internalizing a parasitic idea called cultural relativism, and that lays the foundation for then the suicidal empathy of open borders.
What are you talking about?
Okay, he says here, honor killings, shut up. Child marriages, shut up. Who's saying shut up about honor killings? Who is saying you can't criticize child brides? Who is excusing FGM?
Yeah.
I can't see anyone doing any of those things.
Yeah, it's such a straw man. People criticize that stuff all the time, and they don't get told to shut up, except by people committing these acts, right? That's the only people that are telling them to shut up. And then they just keep talking. Like, it's literally not a thing that happens. And it happens so infrequently and it's immediately a huge story, and they're punished for it.
Yeah, exactly. And look, he's here to tell Joe that the progressive woke feminists, essentially, they're guilty of suicidal empathy to the point of the destruction of society. But it's those progressive feminists who've been campaigning more strongly and effectively against the issues he's listing here. The only times I've seen Gad Saad talking about FGM is when he's using it to attack the suicidal empathy of woke progressives. Like, he's not doing anything else about it other than that. He's just using it as a cudgel to beat people with.
Yeah,
and to be
great
clear,
point.
FGM, it's illegal in the UK. It carries a penalty of 14 years imprisonment. If you're found to be taking a girl abroad to be mutilated or to be aiding and abetting with that at all, you're also guilty of a crime. So it just fundamentally isn't true that people are unable to criticize FGM while deciding whether to let immigrants into a country. We've actually criminalized it, and we send people to prison for it.
Yeah, I looked it up in the United States and Canada. It's both illegal in both places. And, by the way, killing in general, whether it's honor as a motivation or not, also a crime in both those places. And I'm sure in the UK as well. You can't just kill people. I don't care what your motivation is. It's just a silly thing to say out loud, as if somehow we look at a group of people who are coming in and saying, well, this is legal where they're from. And so we need to just sort of abide by rules that are and whether or not it's illegal, because again, the legality of it in certain places doesn't matter. It still might happen in certain places, or those might be more close-knit communities that don't report people. It's a really more complex thing than just saying legality, right? But if it happens and it's culturally something that happens somewhere else and it comes here, it's not like we're just gonna be like, well, better change all our laws because they have a different thing that they think. That's never happened, and it doesn't happen.
No, exactly. And in fact, the people who end up being the victims of this are the ones who set up advocacy groups about it and the ones doing the work to try and undo it. And often those people, when it comes to these kind of issues, are Muslim. Like, some of the people who are pushing back most against the FGM practice of Islam are women who've been through it because they were Muslim. So, it just isn't true. There is no country that I know of in the West that has a policy of open borders either. And there's no strong movement within any country I'm aware of to even push for a movement like that. It becomes yet another straw man in service to his particular notion that suicidal empathy is everything, because he's got a book to sell and, there's no straw man he's not willing to sacrifice in order to get those sales.
Yeah, that open borders comment's like literally a non sequitur. Out of nowhere, he just throws suicidal empathy of open borders in at the very end. And that just feels like he's just tagging buzzwords that he needs to tag on this particular show.
Well, I think he's saying it because he's saying that you can't have open borders because there are some people who just will not assimilate to the American Western ethos. And therefore, an open border at all is going to destroy America, destroy the West, because you're moving in people who will never be able to be compatible with it. Obviously, it's bullshit.
Yeah, it's all bullshit. And I think that this is obviously just him, again, suggesting that no one from a Muslim background can reject their culture. And their culture is incompatible with Western values. This has been his shtick on Twitter for decades, and it's something that he finally is trying to cash in with a book that he wrote, so he can basically get all those people who followed him on Twitter that were hate-mongering on Twitter following him to come follow him and actually purchase a book from him.
Yeah.
All right. In this next clip, they're talking about the destruction of Gaza.
Right, but in that situation, what they're doing is they're being motivated by what they see as a complete destruction of Gaza.
Right.
So it's a different situation, because if there was no attacks on Gaza and Gaza was its own, autonomous or completely separate state, and it wasn't controlled by Israel, and there was no conflict, I doubt they would have the same mindset. Like, the mindset is coming out of watching the destruction of Gaza. And so then instead of saying, hey, we shouldn't just be bombing this city into oblivion and supporting this, instead they go all the way and support the ideology of the authoritarian rulers of this area, which is kind of kooky.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's much like a religion. You can abandon all logic as long as you adhere to and you have to, in fact, if you want to be accepted. And this is one of the things about the left is, like, there's never someone left enough. And when you think you're left enough, they move the border. They move the boundary lines. The goalposts are like a mile further to the left. You're like, oh, God, I got to support drag queens teaching kids now by themselves. No parental supervision, twerking. It's like it just keeps getting nuttier and nuttier to where any protest of it is heresy.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets very strange, and it behaves completely like a religion.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's wild to hear Joe talking about essentially the open window shifting too far to the left when we both think he is like a gnat's hair away from having Nick Fuentes on the show.
I know, right?
Like an open white nationalist, yeah. But listen to what Joe is even saying here, because he's saying it's reasonable to be against the destruction of Gaza. Okay, not sure that Gad Saad is going to agree there because he hasn't done at various other points in this conversation. But that people go so far as to be actively supporting authoritarian rulers over in Gaza. Where? Who does that? Who is saying that, well, Gaza, the destruction of Gaza is so bad, we should be fully behind Hamas and everything they want to do? No one is saying that, apart from some cherry-picked people that you can find on clips from End Wokeness or, libs of TikTok.
Yeah.
Show me any of the queers for Palestine who actively support Hamas rather than just advocating for the citizens of Palestine. You can't do that because they don't exist.
Yeah, I think in some ways he wants to sort of separate himself from other people that also oppose Israel attacks on Gaza, and specifically people on the left. And so I think he's trying to say that I'm doing it for the right reasons. I oppose this for the right reasons, but everyone else on the left, they're twisted and kooky, and they can only do it for the wrong reasons. So they might fumble into morality, but they only do it through like twisted logic, and if they're crazy, that's the only way that they can actually do it. Interesting to hear these guys, how much Drag Queen Story Hour just lives rent-free in their heads. It is so embarrassing to hear them talk about this as if like this is the major issue that's facing the United States today. And this is something you gotta bring this up every time somebody on the left talks about anything. All right. This last one is the last clip in our undercard, and it is talking about how the West is a woman to be mounted.
Other examples of suicidal empathy. So I talk in the book about something I introduce as cultural theory of mind, right? So theory of mind is, as I discussed earlier, it's at the individual level. For you and I to have a meaningful conversation, I need to be in your mind and vice versa.
Right.
Cultural theory of mind is the same principle, but it operates at the cultural level. So if culture A has a set of values that it adheres to, and if it presumes that those values are processed in exactly the same way by the other culture, and that's a wrong presumption, I argue that that culture then lacks cultural theory of mind, because it is assuming that its values transcend in exactly the same way to other cultures. Now, why is that related to suicidal empathy? So if you take, for example, the values that we hold dear in the West, magnanimity, generosity, kindness, empathy, they're interpreted in other societies as weakness, 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 and weakness. And this is why I don't remember if I mentioned this to you before on the show or not. In Arabic, when people would speak to me, I mean, many years ago now they recognize me, so they're not going to be as forthright in their positions. But 25 years ago, they would all tell me the West is a woman to be mounted. Well, the reason why they're saying
They would all tell you that?
I mean, not all, but
it was very common.
But it was a saying that is often, intimated.
Was this when you were living in Lebanon?
No, in Montreal. In Montreal.
Okay, they'd all say this. All of them? No. It's like, yeah, you don't know them. They live in Canada. You don't know the ones I'm talking about. They live in Montreal. Fucking hell. Look, he's saying here, some cultures, they're just not compatible with the superior culture of the West. This is a straw man. Like, show me a single culture that genuinely views generosity and kindness and empathy as antithetical concepts to their culture or as weaknesses. I can't think of one that genuinely thinks, oh, you should never be kind or generous. Those are bad things. No culture thinks that. It's a straw man. You can find outlier regimes where authoritarian leaders exert control and turn their acolytes and their adherents against people to the point where their followers would view the empathy and kindness of their perceived enemies as weaknesses. Like, for example, how Gad Saad is doing with Joe right now. Like, what is Gad Saad doing if not telling Joe that empathy and kindness of the woke left are weaknesses that will lead to their own, suicidal end? He's describing kindness as a weakness right here.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. Great observation, Marsh. This is really just a guy who's trying his damnedest to suggest that Islamic people are here to take advantage of the West's kindness because it's literally the thrust of his entire book, right? That's why he's saying this out loud. And Joe misses such an opportunity here. He pushes back for a second and then totally lets him off the hook, right? They all say it. No, just a few of them. Oh, you're not going to interrogate that anymore? No, we're just going to leave that alone. Okay, well, I guess it was enough of them for me to be satisfied, so we'll just move on. And speaking of which, we're going to move on to our toolbox section.
Wow. So that's the tool bag? And something just fell out of the tool bag?
So for the toolbox this time, we're covering cherry picking. Now, we've covered cherry picking in the past. This is literally just rejecting a ton of other examples so you could pick the ripest example to get your point across.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
is what he's doing here in multiple examples. We've already played 3 or 4 examples of him cherry picking, and here's going to be some more of them. We have a couple more we want to highlight. So this is about 18 minutes into the show. Joe and he are talking about free Palestine.
So I've got a whole verbatim transcript between a street interviewer. These guys that just take someone off the street and they tape it.
Yes.
I think his name. Yeah.
So we just had a little technical glitch. So you were talking about one of those guys that interviews people in the street.
So he goes and intercepts this woman who's at a Free Palestine, rally. Mm-hmm. And he says, oh, you're for Palestine? She goes, yes. She goes, well, what do you think about their positions on, queer people? She goes, well, I'm queer. He goes, oh, you're queer? So what do you think about what they would do to you? She goes, well, they would kill me. She goes, but then you still support them. She goes, yes. He goes, but it doesn't bother you that you're supporting a group that would kill you for the way that you are? She goes, no, the fact that they would kill me doesn't mean that they don't deserve my support. Well, that's the wood cricket, right? I mean, there is no evolutionary mechanism that says I'm going to build an affiliation with a group that I know would kill me. But she is so kind. She's so empathetic. She so transcends the earthly survival instincts that she has ascended to a higher plane of suicidal empathy. So it literally is straight out of what you said.
Okay, so what he's doing here is he's picking a piece of right-wing propaganda he saw. This is one of those man-on-the-street things that people like Project Veritas used to do, where they just go around with a camera all day until they find someone that they can at least either show or edit to show looking like a fool. And he's using this as evidence that this is what people think. This is what the left think. It's what queer people think about Palestine. But it's just cherry-picked. Like there's a million other things you could show instead.
Yeah, and listen to what he's saying here. He's saying that this person is an empathetic person, but the people who she's supporting, they would kill her, right? Well, the United States, pretty warlike country, has gone to war many times in my life. They've attacked multiple nations. And I used to live in Chicago, and there would constantly be protests against that. Immediately, as soon as we went to war with somebody, there would be a protest in the middle of downtown Chicago constantly. Those people who were at that protest, if they were magically transported to the place where the conflict was happening, might actually die in that conflict because the people who we're attacking and who we're committing war against might see those Americans as enemies and kill them, right? That could happen. Yeah. That absolutely could. But those people, nonetheless, were standing in the middle of the United States, perfectly safe, trying to say, we shouldn't be doing this. This is the exact same things that are happening. She's not in any danger from the people who might disagree with her lifestyle. She's not in any danger from them. She's just saying, we shouldn't kill them. That's what she's saying. So instead, he's trying to paint it as if she is some sort of crazy person who, if she were in that position, she would die. Well, she's not in that position. Yeah. She's here, and she's saying, please don't kill those people. That's all she's saying. That's not a suicidally empathetic thing to do. That's just her being empathetic in a way that is not in any way suicidal towards her because she's not in any danger.
Yeah, exactly. And we've heard Joe bring this up at times as well. And what this really is she's saying that she believes in the human rights of people who wouldn't believe in her human rights. How does that make her the bad guy?
Yeah, I don't understand that.
That's a commitment to ethics to even those who wouldn't have that same commitment to you. Like those two things don't have to go hand in hand.
Yeah.
The alternative is I want everybody to be killed if they don't agree with my ethics. That would make me a bad person.
Such a great point, Marsh. It's exactly right. Yeah. And also look at what he's doing here. Instead of saying this person, we're saying that this person is empathetic. He's saying this person is, a sort of wood cricket. He says to them, he's like, basically, that's the wood cricket thing. Well, what is he equating the parasite to with the wood cricket? Who's the parasite in this equation? It's Palestine. It's Palestinians. That's who the parasite is, who's infecting their brain. So look at how he's dehumanizing not one, but two different groups in this particular example that he's saying. Next up, they talk about how all religions are not the same.
This is why, many times when I've come on this show, I've talked about some of those difficulties that, all religions are not indistinguishable from each other. Religions have certain features that might be transferable from one religion to the other.
Right.
But there are many elements that are very specific to a given religion.
Sure.
If you're an extremist Jain, then you really take your using this the sweeping thing when when they walk, they use a broom so that they inadvertently don't step on an ant and kill it. So an extremist in quotes, Jain, someone who really takes his religion seriously, is someone who's going to be extremist in his pacifism. Right? Now, that religion has very, very different edicts about how to conduct yourself, even when you're walking on a sidewalk, than maybe will an Abrahamic faith, whether it be Judaism or Christianity or Islam. So the idea that ultimately all religions are simply preaching the same indistinguishable thing in slightly different ways is simply not true. But it feels good to think that, right?
Right.
It's empathetic for us to think that. We should
Right.
never speak amongst mixed company about politics and religion. So therefore, if I start saying something that might be pejorative of another religion, that feels icky. That feels gauche.
Icky.
So again, yeah, it's icky. This is him actively trying to cherry pick here. You know,
Yeah.
not all extreme religions are bad because an extremist Jain would just be too pacifist. So therefore, there must be good religions and bad religions, and therefore we can say without undue prejudice that Islam is in the bad category. Notably, he's not going to say here, for example, whether extreme Jews are bad or not, because he comes from a Jewish background.
Mm-hmm.
But if we did choose Jews as an example, there are ultra-Orthodox Jews who are hugely misogynistic. They consider homosexuality to be a disease no more acceptable than incest. You could do the same with Christianity. There've been the views of extreme Christianity have been very well documented in the back catalogs of both of our podcasting careers.
Yeah.
Is Islam uniquely harmful in its extremity? I don't think so. I think that's why he's picking this particular thing he thinks is a single example he can find. Ironically, even extreme Jains are also like not all just harmful ultra-pacifists, because extreme sects of Jainism consider women to be inferior to men and incapable, therefore, of being able to achieve liberation. They put at the center of their version of karma, like at the center of their ideas, there's a version of karma that blames people's circumstances and their past life sins. So if you were born disabled, you deserved it. They induct
Wow.
minors into their monastic order before they have a chance to consent to being in it. So extreme Jains could also be problematic. Religion is bad. Extreme religion is extremely bad. And Gad Saad, he tried to pick a cherry here and he still managed to miss one.
And not only is this a cherry pick, but there's also a straw man in here where he's like, people say all religions are the same. I look, I'm sure that there are a few people out there that say this sort of thing, but I don't think that's a common sentiment. I don't think a lot of people think all religions are the same. I have often heard like they're all worshiping the same God from certain types of people. I've heard that before, but
Yeah.
like all religions are the same. I mean, anybody who knows anything about religion and the litany of wars fought over, you know, literally religions that are the same name that are just slightly different will fight each other and they will kill each other. So that happens all the time throughout our history. So I think anybody who knows anything about history and anything about religion knows that there's a lot of people who don't agree that all religions are exactly the same. This next clip's about proselytizing.
Now, let's take, for example, Judaism. And it's not because I'm Jewish, but it's just to compare. Judaism is precisely the opposite. It is an anti-proselytizing language. You're not allowed to proselytize. As a matter of fact, if you proselytize, let's say I try to convince you, Joe, why don't you join the tribe? And you say, you know what? I think I'd like to.
It's a grind.
It's a grind.
It's
Exactly.
a long haul. My uncle did it.
Well, there you go. Thank you. So it is literally in the canons of Judaism to try to dissuade the prospective convert to coming into the fold, because the idea is to have a costly signal of your commitment, your religious piety to want to join the group. So it is a grind. It's very hard. In Islam, you just have to say the one proclamation, the Shahada, one sentence, and you're in. Now try to get out. There are apostasy laws against you getting out. So the circuitry of Islam is one that is expansionist. That's why you have 2 billion Muslims. 1 out of every 4 human beings is Muslim. And it only took 1,400 years for that. So from a marketing perspective, as someone who studies consumer behavior, Islam is a brilliant marketing religion. It has found a way to get a lot of customers and adherents. Judaism sucks at marketing because the entire circuitry of Judaism is meant to keep it very, very small. And so which one is likely to lead to greater problems? The one that is meant to ensure that all of us become Muslim, or the one that says, even if your uncle wants to become Jewish, we're going to put the barrier so high that nobody will ever become Jewish. So we still have only 15 million Jews, roughly, in the world, almost the same as we had before the Holocaust. So Judaism sucks as a marketing religion. Islam, incredibly successful.
Okay, so what he's saying here is that there are 2 billion Muslims in the world. But he's cherry picking that as well because he's comparing it to Judaism. If he was to compare it to Christianity, there's 2.6 billion Christians. We're not talking about how successful at marketing Christianity is because he's cherry picking. He's trying to compare it to something he can use to make a specific point here. He's also making a faulty inference, I think, because he's making it seem like a religion that wants everyone to be part of it is inherently more problematic than one that wants to keep itself small. But I don't think that necessarily logically follows. It can follow, but it's not necessarily the direct following. Here's a counterexample. If you had a workers' union that wants to try and get as many workers of the world to unite as possible for collective bargaining power, is that more or less likely to be good for people than an exclusive club of billionaire factory owners who want to keep the benefits of membership to a select few? I'd argue that in that case, the group that wants to expand its membership to incorporate as many people as possible is more likely to be good for people than having a group out there that keeps its membership incredibly small. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that the Jews are like billionaire factory owners, to be absolutely clear, because other people who'd go on Joe Rogan might be making that kind of comparison. I'm saying that the argument he's making doesn't necessarily logically follow as inevitably as he'd like Joe to believe. And that's when he's even using a very specific example that he's trying to bring in order to draw this comparison, because he could try other examples, but they wouldn't allow for this comparison to be made.
Yeah. This next clip, it's about shark attacks.
I'll just give you a couple of examples. In Sharm el-Sheikh, which is a Red Sea resort area in Egypt, and Jamie is welcome to fact check me if he wants. And I think in 2010, there was a spat of shark attacks on tourists in Sharm el-Sheikh. Do you remember after the investigation by the Egyptian authorities what they concluded?
No.
Want to take a guess?
No.
It was that there is very, very clear evidence that those sharks were Zionist trained because yes, sir. Because the way that you can harm the Egyptian economy, certainly in that region, is to render the tourism activity lesser if you have many attacks. And so I'm not saying every Egyptian thought this, but this was coming from the authorities saying that there's really very clear evidence that those sharks were Jewish assholes. Okay?
Well, hold on a second. Wasn't there some evidence that there was illegal dumping of carcasses, of animal carcasses offshore?
As specific to that incident?
I think that had something to do with the shark activity. Israeli conspiracy theory. Attack sparked conspiracy theories of possible Israeli involvement. Egyptian television broadcast claims from South Sinai government Mohammed Abdul Fadil Shosha that Israeli divers captured a shark with a GPS unit planted on its back, allegedly by Mossad, describing the theory as sad. Professor Mohammed Hanafi of Suez Canal University pointed out that GPS devices are used by marine biologists to track sharks, not control them remotely. Okay, but wasn't there something to do...
Yeah, that's what the last sentence speaks to what you said.
Yeah, ultimately thought the dumping of sheep carcasses, there it is, during the Islamic festival of... How do you say that? How do you say the festival name?
Eid al-Adha.
On 16 November was most likely explanation. That makes sense. That's why there was so much shark activity.
But the fact that somebody somewhere said, I think this got Jewish signature all over it.
Right, but there's people in the United States that think the world's flat. That doesn't mean it makes sense.
The capacity to be parasitized is hardly restricted to Muslim minds. Everybody has the capacity to believe stupidity. So I agree. But there is a unique feature of the Muslim mind that tends to find causality in all maladies in the Jew.
So his argument here is so weak that even Joe casually debunks it.
He really does. I'm not sure how I need to feel about this, that there's a Wikipedia page where an authority has to tell people we don't have devices that can mind control sharks. I don't think it's supposed to make me feel good, Marsh, but
great.
We definitely have that Wikipedia page, and that feels a little frightening to me. Also, I'd never heard at all about this conspiracy theory, and it's crazy how much Joe knows about different conspiracy theories because he already knows before he even calls up the Wikipedia page that it's debunked. Does that make him a better skeptic than me? And I want you to think really carefully before you answer that question, Marsh, before you answer that.
I mean, let's face it, he knows it's debunked because he initially believed it and then had to check. You've just never heard of it, so never bothered having to check before. That's what this is.
Fair enough. I'll accept that answer.
But Gad Saad is bringing up this idea that, well, Muslim people even thought that there were Jews controlling sharks. Yeah. And Joe points out, well, that's not really particularly true. And where does he recede to? He recedes to, well, even the fact that somebody could think something as preposterous as that is evidence of how bad this all is. But it isn't evidence of that. You're just cherry picking here. You found an outlier opinion and you're treating it like it was mainstream. Joe is right. This is like saying that all Americans are flat earthers because you can find an American flat earther. And I love that he ends this. Gad Saad ends it by saying, well, yeah, obviously being this stupid isn't restricted to Muslim minds, but that there is a unique feature of Muslim minds that means they'd be this stupid. Yeah. That's what his last sentence is saying.
Yeah.
And what do you mean by the Muslim mind? What do you mean by that? Because it feels a lot like that blank slate felon idea that we had at the start. You know, some people are just born with the genetics for this stuff and they can't escape those genetics. It's just bad genes.
Yeah, be careful. Be careful where you tread there. And what if someone said this exact same thing in reverse? There is a unique feature in the Jewish mind that tends to find causality in all the maladies in the Muslim. I wonder how they would find that anti-Semitic if they were to say that, right?
Yeah.
That sounds anti-Semitic to me.
He'd be right to, yeah.
Yeah. Also, isn't that just the clunkiest way to say something? Like it feels overly complex. I don't know. All right.
Yeah, I mean, he does try throughout this interview to try and say things that are overly complexly worded in order to try and make him seem smart. He says things like, oh, the statistical inference of this is such and such. It's not quite what he means. He's just trying to use... I think he knows that Joe has that little switch in the back of his brain or that little scruff on the back of his neck that if an academic comes in and starts using academic language, it's like pinching the scruff on a kitten and he just goes limp.
Every academic just puts Joe in their mouth and walks around the studio.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really kind of cute, actually.
Yeah, it is.
He's like a little Jimothy. All right. Next up, this is the last clip in our Toolbox section, and this is talking about Gaza and Hamas.
What I'm saying is images of destruction are very vivid to our brain, right?
They should be, don't you think?
But that doesn't mean that that's the information that I use to establish what is morally righteous.
What else can we use other than information?
We can use what is the existential calculus that animates each society. One society says, we'll even help you build a better society. Just please don't spend all your time screaming about eradicating every last one of us. The other society says, yeah, I don't think so. If we're ever strong enough to kill all of... Unfortunately, we were only strong enough to kill 1,200 of you. And boy, that was orgiastically pleasing. But if tomorrow, God willing, hey, maybe the Iranians have nuclear bombs, we can eradicate all you assholes. My God, the world would be a better place.
So this is Hamas saying that, right?
Well,
and the people that live in Palestine that were killed, these 70,000 plus people, how many of them do you think were Hamas?
Well, the numbers that I hear is that it was 1-to-1 ratio, which apparently is a pretty good ratio.
Where are those numbers coming from?
I mean, like, you want me to give you the reference? I don't know.
No. I mean, is it coming from Israel? Is it coming from Hamas? Is it coming from Palestine?
So the one I'm going to use is from John Spencer. Do you know who that is?
No.
John Spencer is a urban war researcher. I think he's at what's the military where they train the military? West Point. He's a professor of urban warfare. He's come on my show, and based on whatever analyses that he's done, he's not Jewish. He's not uniquely pro-Zionist. Is that he's saying, and again, I see to whomever knows better about this than I do. I don't know all the details. He said that the ratio of civilian to fighters killed in the Gaza war is better than most other comparable situations.
So Hamas had 35,000.
I think it's 1-to-1.
So Hamas had 35,000 militants in Gaza.
If the 1-to-1 number is right and 70, that's what it would be.
So the whole thing, it's not a big issue. They're doing it very responsibly. And the reason we know that is because of the expertise of John Spencer, the war and the urban war researcher. It turns out he's just cherry-picking the word of a guy who actually is not reflective of what other experts in this area say. Here's something on John Spencer that I found. Spencer praised Israel's ratio of civilian casualties in Gaza as historically low for modern warfare, citing IDF claims that 50 to 60% of Gazans killed were civilians and previous estimates of 80 to 90% of casualties in modern conflicts being civilians. Spencer's claims were echoed by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. However, Professor Michael Spaggett at the University of London wrote that the statistics Spencer cites and his conclusions are false. Spaggett cites academic analysis showing the idea that 80 to 90% of casualties in war are civilians is a myth. Spaggett points out the Uppsala Conflict Data Program database of wars shows 42 to 55% of casualties are civilians in modern warfare. In urban warfare, it's 40 to 70%. Spaggett estimates that 80% of Gaza casualties are civilians, concluding that civilian casualties in Gaza are higher than the average for both urban warfare and modern warfare. So that is other experts citing other academic expertise and analysis of this area, completely disagreeing with John Spencer, the person that Gad Saad happens to be resting this entire argument on. And when he says John Spencer isn't Jewish, he's not uniquely pro-Zionist, well, in this context he is. If you look at his Wikipedia page, he's often criticized for being too willing to just parrot the line as given by the Israeli government and not to challenge it. So lo and behold, he's the person that Gad says is the reliable expert for this stuff, and not any of the people who disagree with him, of which there are a plethora.
Let's wrap it up with that. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you very much. You're a beautiful person.
All right, Marsh, here we are. End of the show. Anything good in this episode?
Yeah, there is. And there's a point at which Saad is very obviously engaging in whataboutery. We might cover it in the off-the-record segment. He is bringing up, like, if people care about this, why didn't they care about this thing over here? And Joe calls him out on it pretty quickly, and he does a pretty good job of doing that as well. Joe is talking about the obliteration of Gaza.
Yeah.
And about how even if you think it was morally justified, tactically, it's only going to lead to further radicalization and hatred, which is only going to inflame things even further. And I think that's a good point. So yeah, Joe actually wins some points and scores pretty well in parts of this conversation.
Yeah, I agree. There's some points that Joe does push back pretty vociferously in this episode. And I think like that's pretty good, but I think a lot of times he gives up. And so like there's not really there might be an initial push, but rarely is there like a second push on when the answer isn't very good. So we'll see that we saw that throughout today, and we'll probably see it in the off the record segment. But I really think the good thing about this is that this is one of these smaller names. Often the people who get the most press on his show are the people who are the politicians or these really big thought leaders that come on his show, or these billionaires that come on his show. Those are the people who get most of the press. Sometimes these big podcasters who come on his show. And this, I think, is sort of where we get to see the sausage get made in Joe's head, right? These are the academics who come in to plant these seeds that the politicians and these other sort of thought leaders come in to water and help grow. But genuinely, this is like him and Jordan Peterson. These are people who come in and really do a lot of the groundwork to sort of implant all these ideas into Joe. And so it's always interesting to like pay attention to these episodes because you get a chance to see sort of where these ideas that Joe has come from. And Joe, as we've seen, talks about suicidal empathy all the time because he heard about it in a previous Gad Saad appearance.
Yeah. And the thing about this is there was a clip that, or a piece of this that went viral. It was being covered in sort of various other kind of blogs and news things, but it was the bit about Gad Saad saying he's trying to move to America. And that is the part of this show that got attention and not any of the rest of the stuff that we've covered here, which I think we've proved is way more consequential and worth coverage. Well, that's it for our show this week. Remember that you can access more than half an hour of bonus content every single week from as little as $1 per episode. You can do it by subscribing at patreon.com/NoRogan. Meanwhile, you can hear more from Cecil at Cognitive Dissonance and Citation Needed. And you can hear more from me at Skeptics with a K and the Skeptic podcast. And we'll be back next week for a little more of the No Rogan experience.
love the show, please rate and share it. If you want to get in touch with us, become a patron, or check out the show notes, go to knowrogan.com, KNOWROGAN.com.